So here we have a very important artifact. This is one of two of the original doors that were in the house that were somehow saved from the house when it's burning in 1845. And we even have an oral history from early 20th century that said they saved doors from the fire. What makes this important is this little molding, which doesn't look like anything special, is a uncommon type of molding, and the four places where this occurs at Monticello are things that John Hemmings made. So this is kind of a little signature of Hemmings, and furniture experts will tell you all the time that certain craftsmen have a little signature that they use in making furniture. This is John Hemmings or his nephew's signature. We also see that this is varnished walnut. If you look at the back of this, you'd see it's painted because later in the 19th century and probably even into the 20th century, into the 1940s, somebody stopped telling the story that this was a special door, and they painted it and they cut it down on all four sides. It's had three different generations of hardware, but if you look carefully, you can tell what's the first, the second, and the third set of hardware. So it took a conservator, a professional conservator, 1 year to take the paint off of this face using a scalpel. Why a scalpel? Because you couldn't use chemical means to remove the paint because you'd be wiping out the original varnish surface. So this, it looked kind of beat up as a door, but this took a lot of time to get it to this state. And this has been so popular that two museum exhibitions recently have borrowed this as a John Hemmings artifact. So it's become a powerful symbol and artifact with the story of John Hemmings or his nephews. So you can see this just looks like a regular door, but if you add this up, it's like 20 different pieces that make up a regular panel door. And every one of these has to be perfectly fit with the right molding. And then you have to, in the very beginning of Poplar Forest, doors were being made at Monticello, but then you got to get them down here, which is a 3-day journey. Later, John Hemmings is making the doors on site. So again, this is all a very complex, choreographed process of Jefferson. Once he starts living here for 5 years, when the walls are just bare brick and there are no doors and no ceilings, that doesn't matter because it's still peace and quiet. For 14 years, Jefferson is getting all the right workers here at the right time to do all these parts. And sometimes the worker is told to get some wood and send it to the mill, cut down a tree and send it to the mill to get it cut up. And he'll say the mills aren't working because there's low water, and so then they have to cut it by hand. There are all kinds of great insights into Jefferson as the supervisor, the architect, the builder, and then the story of the workers, what they do and why they did it and how they did it. So the other artifact in here is a reproduction fireback. If we look at this fireplace, you see a two-sided iron fireback. We saw the evidence for it on the opposite side of the room, and they're little pins that have never moved. They're original. And in this case over here, we have a big chunk of that fireback that was found in a barn. How do we get the reproduction? Well, there was a company in Richmond that still does sand casting. So what we had to do is take our original chunk of it, looked at the details of that, showed it to the guys at the foundry. They then make a wooden mold of that. Then they put the wooden mold in a special kind of sand that makes an impression. Then you put that together and you pour molten steel into that, and you end up with a fireback that was made almost exactly like it was in Jefferson's time. There are only a few little things in that foundry that are modern. The rest are pretty much the same 19th century technology. So that's the kind of thing you have to find, and you got to find the right people, and it's got to look the right way when it's finished. So that's true of all the parts here. And again, Poplar Forest has never had all the money we needed to do everything at one time. We just do things slowly, carefully, in the right sequence. And we are like any nonprofit. We are a private corporation, and we rely on people to support us. But that still doesn't mean that you need to cut corners or do it wrong. People who want to donate to a project like this are not stupid. They will see whether you're doing it right or not right. It's incumbent on me and our staff to tell the story. We tell the story of how we get this fireback made, all the steps we went through, what the original looks like, and then people, they get it. They understand why it takes time, why it takes money, why you go to all these extra links. It's all about the storytelling. And at Poplar Forest, we are very story rich. From Jefferson's design to the workers to the Hemmings young men who are working here to everything that happened after Jefferson lived here. We consider our historic period as a museum all the way up until the corporation buys this in 1983. So 4 different families of people that lived here for almost 200 years. That is our whole story, but can we tell all those stories in what we're doing here? No. We made a decision that the most significant story here was Jefferson, and that's why we removed things that were from the 1840s and the 1940s, because we wanted to interpret one period. There are still choices to be made. There are 2 brick buildings over here that are after Jefferson's time from the 1850s. One of them is a slave quarter building. Theoretically, we should get rid of it because it's not Jefferson, but we're keeping that because that's an important story to tell, even though it's post-Jefferson. So every single museum site has to make these decisions about what you want to interpret, and then how you interpret it, and how you deliver it to the public. So the one thing that changes on museum properties, house museums and history sites, is the interpretation. So if we were doing this project in 1920, we would have done it one way, and in retrospect, I'd probably say it wasn't done right. If this was done in 1950, you'd do it one way. So every so often, there are big shifts in the professional scene of better technology, better investigative techniques, better things that we know not to do, because we can look back and say, we don't want to do that because it messed up something. We did this project with the best of professional standards, and sometimes with the knowledge that in 50 years somebody might want to do something different. So we've tried to make the artifact the most precious thing and not hurt any evidence that somebody in the future might want to revisit. So that's the one big difference, is we know that things change and restorations are redone over and over and over. And the earlier the house museum is established, the more of those changes have taken place. And usually the more evidence is lost, because whoever is doing a restoration will think, I've done it right, and nobody is going to have to redo it. And that's a very bad attitude, because you might not document enough things, you might not save enough things. So, you know, interpretation will change, staff will change, consultants will change, but everybody should still have a clear picture of your artifact as being conserved and passed on into the future, regardless of how you are interpreting the stories. So that's really the most professional attitude, is to recognize changes that have taken place and to anticipate changes that might happen. So, you know, historical interpretation for a house like this is not unlike your professor assigning you a history book. She is not going to give you a history book that was printed in 1900, because it's going to be laughable, probably. She's going to give you one that was printed last year, because the interpretation of history in a academic setting, in books, changes with each generation, or several times in a generation, just like the interpretation of a house might change. So, you know, there are two types of history. One is the history of a past event. That's not going to change. It happened, and that's the way it was. The other type of history is interpreting that past event, and that interpretation is kind of a moving target. So those are things to kind of see beyond the setting, in terms of how each site treats history, and then what do you give the public from that history.